Have you ever had an entire conversation with someone who wasn't even there? Not just a few sentences, a complete conversation. You imagined what they would say. You knew exactly how you would respond. You predicted their reaction. You changed your answer halfway through. Maybe you even won an argument that never actually happened. And then, suddenly, you realized you've been sitting there silently for the last 10 minutes. Nothing happened. Nobody said anything. The entire situation existed only inside your head. Gemini, does that sound familiar? Because if it does, you're definitely not the only one. There is something strange about the Gemini mind. It rarely waits for reality to happen before exploring what reality could become. One small thought can turn into a conversation. That conversation becomes a situation. That situation creates 5 possible outcomes. Those 5 outcomes create another 10 questions, and before you know it, you've mentally lived through an entire experience that never actually happened. Maybe you're lying in bed. Maybe you're taking a shower. Maybe you're driving somewhere. Maybe you're supposed to be listening to someone talk. And suddenly, you're somewhere else. Not physically, mentally. You're imagining what would happen if you quit your job tomorrow. What would your boss say? What would you say? Would they try to convince you to stay? Would you finally tell them everything you've been holding back? Maybe you'd walk out calmly. Maybe you'd say something dramatic. Maybe you'd disappear and start an entirely different life. And somehow, 5 minutes later, you're imagining yourself living in another city. Different apartment, different career, different friends, different routine. All because one random thought entered your mind. What if I quit? That's Gemini. One thought rarely stays one thought. It multiplies. And this is where people misunderstand you. They think you're distracted. Sometimes you are. They think you're overthinking. Sometimes you definitely are. But there's something else happening underneath all of that. Your mind naturally explores possibilities. Reality gives you one version of events. Your imagination immediately asks, what about the other versions? What if I said this? What if they said that? What if I had made a different decision? What if I meet this person again someday? What if everything goes wrong? What if everything goes right? What if I suddenly become successful? What if I leave everything behind? What if they secretly feel the same way? What if they don't care at all? What if? And Gemini can follow those questions much further than anyone around them realizes. That's why sometimes you're physically present, but mentally living 3 different lives. The strange thing is that these imaginary scenarios don't always involve things you actually want to happen. Sometimes they're completely ridiculous. You can imagine an argument with someone you have absolutely no problem with. You can imagine explaining yourself to someone who never asked. You can imagine what you would say if someone accused you of something they have never accused you of. You can imagine how you would respond if someone betrayed you, even though they haven't betrayed you. You can imagine meeting someone you haven't seen in 10 years. What would you say? Would you hug them? Would you pretend you didn't see them? Would they recognize you? Would you recognize them? Would the conversation be awkward? Would they apologize? Would you care? Suddenly, you're emotionally reacting to an event that hasn't happened and may never happen. Then reality interrupts. Your phone vibrates, someone says your name, the traffic light changes, and for half a second, you have to remember where you actually are. This is one of the strangest Gemini experiences. Your external life can be completely ordinary, while your internal life is unbelievably loud. Someone looking at you might see a person sitting quietly. They have no idea that 5 seconds ago you were mentally defending yourself in court, moving to another country, reconnecting with an ex, winning an imaginary argument, and deciding what you'd say in an interview after becoming famous, all before dinner. But why does the Gemini mind do this? The answer begins with curiosity. Gemini is traditionally associated with Mercury. The planet astrologers connect with communication, information, language, learning, and mental movement. And whether or not you take astrology literally, The Gemini archetype has always been associated with a restless relationship with information. Gemini doesn't simply receive information. Gemini plays with it. You hear one sentence and immediately imagine what else it could mean. Someone sends, "Okay, that's it." One word. Most people might read it and continue with their day. Gemini looks at the screen. Okay? Why did they put a period? Are they angry? Maybe they're busy. No, wait. They normally say, "Okay, this was just okay. Something's different. Did I say something? Maybe I'm imagining it. Actually, they're probably fine. Unless..." And there it goes. One word, 7 theories, 3 imaginary conversations, 2 possible arguments, and somehow you've already prepared an apology for something nobody has accused you of doing. Gemini, sometimes your greatest talent is also your greatest inconvenience. Because the same mind that can see possibilities other people miss can also create problems that don't exist. This is where imagination becomes overthinking. There's an important difference between the two. Imagination asks, what could happen? Overthinking says, one of these things definitely will happen, and I need to prepare for all of them. That's when your internal scenarios stop being entertaining and start becoming exhausting. You replay a conversation. Maybe someone said something strange. At first you don't think much about it. Then later, your mind returns. Wait, what did they mean by that? You replay their tone, their face, the exact wording. Maybe there was another meaning, maybe there wasn't. So you recreate the conversation, except this time you answer differently. Then you imagine how they would respond to your new answer. Then you respond to their imaginary response. And suddenly you're having version 2 of a conversation that already ended. Then version 3, then version 4, and eventually the imaginary conversation becomes longer than the real one ever was. This is why Gemini sometimes thinks of the perfect response hours after the moment has passed. During the actual conversation, you're processing too many things at once. Their words, their expression, your reaction, the environment, what they might mean, what you should say, what you shouldn't say. Then later, when everything becomes quiet, your brain finally goes, "Oh, that's what I should have said." And now it's too late. But that doesn't stop you from saying it inside your head. Perfect delivery, perfect timing, perfect expression. In your imaginary version, you absolutely destroyed them. Reality, you probably said, "Yeah, whatever," then went home. But imaginary conversations aren't always about conflict. Sometimes they're about desire. And this is where things get even more interesting. Gemini can create entire relationships with possibilities. Maybe someone smiles at you differently. That's all. Nothing happens. But your imagination notices. What if they like me? You immediately dismiss it. No, probably nothing. But then, what if? And now you're imagining a conversation, then a date, then what they're actually like when nobody else is around. Would you get along? Would they understand your humor? Would conversation be effortless? Would you get bored? Would they get bored? Could this actually become something? Then you catch yourself. Gemini, you don't even know this person's middle name. And somehow you've already imagined the breakup. That's impressive, but it reveals something important about the way your mind works. You don't only imagine beginnings, you imagine trajectories. Your brain wants to know where things could lead. One interaction becomes a path, and because there are multiple possible paths, your mind wants to walk down all of them, not physically, mentally. This is why Gemini can sometimes become excited about possibilities more than realities. Possibility has no limitations yet. Reality does. In imagination, the conversation goes exactly where it needs to go. The person understands your jokes. The job is perfect. The trip changes your life. The new project becomes successful. The relationship becomes everything you hoped. Then reality arrives, and reality is slower, messier, less perfect. People don't follow the script, and that can create a strange disappointment, not because reality is bad, but because your mind already experienced 10 versions of how good it could have been. This is one of the hidden challenges of having such an active imagination. Sometimes you're not comparing reality to another real experience. You're comparing reality to something that never existed, and reality has almost no chance of winning that competition. Think about relationships. Maybe you're waiting for someone to respond. Your mind imagines the response. You picture exactly what you want them to say. Maybe they finally understand. Maybe they apologize. Maybe they confess something. Maybe they tell you they've been thinking about you. You create the emotional moment. Then the actual message arrives. LOL, yeah. And you're staring at your phone thinking, that's it? Of course that's it. The other person didn't know they had a role in a movie your brain had been directing for the last 20 minutes. That's the Gemini problem. Your mind writes scripts for people who never received the screenplay. Then sometimes you become disappointed when they improvise. But here's where this trait becomes fascinating rather than simply funny. Imaginary scenarios can be a form of preparation. Your brain doesn't always create possibilities because it's anxious. Sometimes it creates possibilities because it enjoys being ready. Before an important conversation, you imagine different reactions. If they say this, I'll say that. If they become defensive, I'll stay calm. If they ask this question, I already know my answer. If they surprise me, well, I'll figure it out. Gemini likes mental rehearsal because information creates confidence. The more possibilities you've considered, the harder it is to completely surprise you. This can make you incredibly quick during real conversations. People sometimes wonder, how did you think of that response so fast? Because you may have had versions of this conversation already, not this exact conversation, but similar possibilities. Your mind has been practicing. It's almost like having a simulation running in the background. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if everything changes? And while that simulation can become exhausting, it also helps explain something Gemini is often good at: improvisation. You don't always need a perfect plan. You need enough possibilities, because once reality chooses one, you adapt. This is why Gemini can appear completely unprepared, then somehow handle the situation. You were preparing differently, not by memorizing one answer, by imagining many. That's also why overly rigid plans can make you uncomfortable. A rigid plan assumes reality will cooperate. Your mind knows better. People change, information changes, circumstances change, you change. So somewhere inside you, there's always a plan B. And sometimes C, D, E, and a completely ridiculous plan F that would probably never work. But you're keeping it just in case. That's the entertaining side of Gemini imagination. But there's another side people don't see. Sometimes these scenarios are where you say things you're afraid to say in real life. You imagine confronting someone. You tell them exactly how they hurt you. You finally explain what you've been feeling. You tell someone you love them. You tell someone you miss them. You tell someone you're leaving. Inside your mind, the words come easily because there are no consequences. Nobody interrupts. Nobody misunderstands. Nobody rejects you. You control both sides of the conversation. And because you control both sides, you can finally reach the ending you wanted. That's why some imaginary conversations aren't meaningless at all. They're emotional rehearsals. Sometimes you're trying to understand what you actually feel. You imagine saying, I don't want you anymore. How does that sentence feel? Relief? Sadness? Nothing? Then maybe that's telling you something. You imagine saying, I still love you. Does that feel true? Or does it sound like something an older version of you would have said? You imagine quitting, leaving, returning, forgiving, confronting, staying, and through those imaginary situations, you discover your real reaction. Gemini often thinks through language. Sometimes you don't fully understand what you're feeling until you hear yourself explain it, even if the person you're explaining it to exists only inside your head. That's why you can mentally talk to people who aren't there. You're not necessarily talking to them. Sometimes you're talking to yourself through them. That's a much deeper distinction. The imaginary person asks the question you need to answer. You answer. They challenge you, you defend yourself, and somewhere inside that mental conversation, you discover what you actually believe. This is why Gemini can change opinions while speaking. You begin explaining one position. Halfway through, you hear your own reasoning. Wait, that doesn't make sense. So you argue against yourself. Then suddenly, you've changed your mind. Someone watching says, "But you literally just said the opposite." Yes, and then you heard a better argument. Sometimes, your own. Welcome to Gemini. Your mind isn't a courtroom with one lawyer. It's a courtroom where both lawyers, the judge, the jury, the witness, and the person interrupting from the back of the room are all you. No wonder you're tired. And nowhere does this become more obvious than at night. During the day, life provides distractions, messages, work, people, noise, responsibilities, places to go, things to do. Then night comes. Everything gets quiet. You lie down. You close your eyes. Finally, peace. And your Gemini brain says, "Perfect. Now that nobody needs us." Remember that embarrassing thing you said 8 years ago? No. Let's analyze it. Please don't. Also, what if you moved to Italy? What? And do you think that person from 2019 actually liked you? Go to sleep. Wait, I just figured out what they meant. And suddenly, it's 2:37 in the morning. You're having an imaginary conversation with someone you haven't spoken to in 4 years. This is perhaps one of the most Gemini experiences imaginable. Your body is begging for rest. Your brain has scheduled a meeting, and attendance is mandatory. But nighttime scenarios reveal something else. When external stimulation disappears, your internal stimulation increases. Your mind doesn't like empty space. If reality isn't providing something interesting, you may create something interesting yourself, a memory, a hypothetical, a fantasy, a problem, a solution, a completely fictional conversation, anything, because mental stillness can feel strange when you're used to constant movement. This doesn't mean every Gemini experiences this constantly. Astrology describes archetypes, not psychological diagnoses. People are individuals, but the symbolism associated with Gemini makes this pattern especially interesting. Because Gemini represents duality, and perhaps one of the deepest expressions of that duality isn't simply having two personalities. It's having the ability to become both sides of a conversation. You ask, you answer, you challenge, you defend, you imagine what another person might think, then argue with that imaginary version of them. You can become your own audience, your own critic, your own advisor, your own enemy, your own best friend, sometimes all within 5 minutes. And this is why the Gemini mind can be such an entertaining place to live, but also such an exhausting one, because there is almost always another possibility, another interpretation, another version, another question, another conversation waiting to happen, even when nothing happened at all. And maybe the strangest part is this: sometimes an imaginary scenario can create a real emotion. Your mind knows the situation isn't happening, but you still feel something. You imagine someone leaving and suddenly feel sadness. You imagine succeeding and feel excitement. You imagine an argument and somehow become genuinely irritated with a person who is probably somewhere peacefully eating dinner, completely unaware that they just offended you in a conversation they never had. Then you have to remind yourself, wait, they didn't actually do anything. That's when Gemini's imagination crosses an interesting line, because possibilities can influence reality, even when reality never created them. And learning to recognize that difference may be one of the most important things an active Gemini mind can ever learn, because your imagination can be one of your greatest gifts. But if you aren't careful, you can start reacting to stories your own mind wrote. And that's where things get really interesting.